They never wanted anyone to know, not the neighbors, not the distant relatives who only saw smiles in family portraits, not even the closest friends who thought they were merely witnessing small town oddities. But beneath the surface, in the creaking floorboards and behind the lace curtains, there existed a marriage so entangled in secrecy, so suffocatingly insidious, that the truth had to be buried. And buried it was for decades, carefully hidden beneath polite nods, half-truths, and the silent terror that passed for normalcy. In the heart of rural America, in a town that had forgotten how to watch its own history, there was a house. Its paint peeled like old skin, the porch sagging under years of weather and neglect. Children of the town whispered about the family that lived there, but only at a distance. Something about the way the windows reflected sunlight, or refused to make even the bravest feel unwelcome. And yet nobody could have guessed the story that slept within its walls, waiting, patient as a shadow. It began with two people who, on the surface, seemed perfectly ordinary. He was the son of a long line of farmers, with hands as calloused as the land he tilled, and eyes that never quite met another's. She was the quiet girl who moved into the area, a daughter of distant relatives, supposedly here for nothing more than a fresh start. But from the moment they were introduced at a town gathering, the atmosphere shifted. There was a closeness, a familiarity in their gestures and glances that unsettled even the adults who had seen marriages bloom and die with predictable ease. No one would speak aloud what they saw. Words like wrong or forbidden never left lips. Still, the weight of something unnatural hung in every room where they lingered. The townspeople noticed the way they seemed to know each other's thoughts before a word was spoken, the way they finished each other's sentences and seemed to move in synchronized rhythms no couple could claim as mere charm. On paper, it looked innocent, but in small towns, innocence is often just the surface of rot. When the wedding was announced, the town murmured with polite curiosity. There were smiles, handshakes, and the obligatory gift: linen sets, silverware, a single bottle of wine from the local store. But in corners, hidden behind floral arrangements and congratulatory smiles, people whispered of a certain unease. Something about their union felt like an echo of the past repeating itself. They joked about it in hushed tones. They must be related somehow. But jokes are the armor small communities use when facing truths too heavy to name. And there it was, in the silent scrutiny of the elders, a recognition that nobody could fully articulate. A marriage not built on love, exactly, but on a history that twisted its roots back into itself. The two partners carried something in their blood, a legacy no one wanted to admit existed. They were the culmination of generations who had made quiet, desperate choices. Choices made in isolation, in fear of scandal, in the shadows of law and morality. Children came. Always children, because in this twisted lineage, reproduction wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion, a ritual passed down like heirlooms no one dared touch. Each birth brought new whispers, new fears, and new layers of secrecy. Records were kept, yes, but carefully. Doctor visits disguised, relatives confused, school registrations vague. Names were altered in subtle ways, connections disguised with the dexterity of a town used to hiding its sins behind polite smiles. And with each generation, the consequences became harder to ignore. Strange illnesses, unusual behaviors, features repeating in ways that even non-experts would notice. Eyes too close together, smiles that mirrored one another, voices that sounded like echoes of the same note. It's difficult to explain how ordinary people can become part of an extraordinary horror without realizing it. The family, at first glance, did nothing that could raise suspicion. They paid taxes. They celebrated birthdays. They attended church, They went to the local market and nodded to neighbors with the kind of smile that masks inner turbulence, and yet, under the quiet surface, the human cost of this lineage was mounting. Loneliness, obsession, fear, and shame became a part of daily life, absorbed in ways that left no scars on the skin but tore endlessly at the soul. To understand this story, you have to look beyond the faces seen in photographs, beyond the letters that spoke of mundane family matters, beyond the land itself. You have to listen to the spaces between the words, the pauses in conversation, the way doors clicked shut and remained closed long after a footstep had passed. It was in those spaces, in those silences, that the marriage revealed its true horror, not in violence or spectacle, but in a quiet, consuming inevitability. Historians like myself often sift through archives looking for truth, only to discover that some truths are actively resisted by the living. In this case, the resistance was palpable. Neighbors who could have shed light chose silence. Teachers who noticed anomalies in the children's development wrote reports that were filed away and never followed. The doctors who saw patterns of congenital issues murmured of bad luck, poor genetics, environmental factors. No one named what they saw, and perhaps in a way no one wanted to. To confront it fully would be to look into the abyss of human desperation and familial obsession. And yet, here we are, because secrets like these have a way of clawing their way into daylight, no matter how carefully buried. The truth is never comfortable, and in this case, it is unbearable. The story of this marriage, of the people trapped within its legacy, is not one of moral judgment or caricature. It is a testament to the fragility of boundaries, the ease with which human nature bends when isolated, and the terrible inertia of generations choosing repetition over reflection. By the time the second generation began to rise, the town's unease became harder to dismiss. Children who were cousins, siblings, and something else entirely began to display traits too consistent to be coincidence. Faces mirrored one another in ways that could unsettle anyone. Voices, laughter, even posture carried echoes of ancestors living quietly, invisibly, in the corners of history. And though no one spoke openly, a shared, unspoken understanding spread through the town. This was a family who carried something unnatural, something that demanded careful watching, but that was ultimately untouchable. This marriage, by all outward measures, appeared benign. Yet beneath it lay a kind of dark continuity, a biological and psychological entanglement that no outside observer could untangle without risking their own sense of reality. By the time outsiders would eventually uncover the details, the story had already been folded into the very fabric of the town's history, invisible yet impossible to ignore. And that is the truth that haunts us. Not a violent crime, not a sensational act, but a quiet, persistent, inbred inevitability that left everyone complicit in its silence. Every handshake, every casual greeting, every glance exchanged in the streets of this town was a tacit agreement. We will pretend this is normal. We will pretend this is not happening, and in doing so, we became witnesses to something that should never have been, and yet cannot be erased. The full horror of what unfolded is not in one moment, but in decades of small, insidious choices. Choices made in bedrooms, kitchens, and classrooms. Choices made in quiet desperation to preserve a family, to maintain appearances, to obey impulses no one dared name. And as historians, as outsiders, as human beings searching for answers, we are left with fragments, whispers, and a gnawing understanding that some stories are designed to remain buried, but only until someone with enough patience, and perhaps enough courage, decides to unearth them. The second generation inherited more than just a name or a farm. They inherited a web, invisible but suffocating, woven from decades of secrecy and unspoken rules. In small towns, lineage matters in ways outsiders rarely comprehend. Bloodlines carry weight, not just in heritage, but in expectation, and in this case, that expectation was invisible but absolute. Maintain the continuity, never question it, and above all, never leave. Children of the first marriage were marked from birth, though no one could fully articulate why. Some bore features that made them stand out, eyes too dark, noses that mirrored each other in uncanny symmetry, smiles that seemed rehearsed. Teachers noticed but wrote it off. Doctors noticed but reassured parents it was genetic variance. Friends whispered but never confronted. It was as if the town collectively agreed that some truths were too dangerous to name. By adolescence, the patterns became undeniable. Siblings, cousins, and distant relatives interacted in ways that carried the weight of instinct rather than affection. There were compulsions, quiet urgencies, behaviors that the children themselves could not explain. They didn't speak openly about it, not because they wanted to hide, but because there were no words that could encompass what was happening. Even in play, even in casual conversation, boundaries were blurred. It was at this point that outsiders occasionally noticed something was wrong. A new teacher, a visiting relative, a stranger passing through. They sensed it in subtle cues, the way the children mirrored one another, the way they completed each other's sentences, the way a casual touch carried an undercurrent of something that should have been forbidden. But these visitors rarely stayed. The town, small and insular, quickly absorbed the observation and redirected attention elsewhere. To stare too long was to invite suspicion. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have turned away or tried to intervene in a cycle so deep it had already seeped into the marrow of the family? By the time the second generation reached adulthood, the effects of the inbred lineage were evident in more than appearance. Illnesses cropped up that defied standard explanation. Mental instability crept in like fog, unspoken but omnipresent. Anxiety, depression, compulsions, and tendencies toward violence simmered beneath the surface, masked by small town politeness and the superficial routines of everyday life. No doctor could name it definitively, and no one dared speak it aloud. It was easier, the town decided, to pretend that the family's troubles were random, a cruel accident of genetics and circumstance. The marriage itself, between first-generation cousins, set a precedent, a template for what would follow. Rules were unwritten but understood. Marry within the line, preserve appearances, never disclose the depth of your connection, and the children raised within this structure absorbed it unquestioningly. The family became a closed ecosystem, self-sustaining, insulated from scrutiny by decades of cultivated silence. Outsiders could see the surface, but the rot beneath remained hidden. Every birthday, every holiday, every church gathering carried undercurrents that were never named. Elders watched silently, passing warnings in looks rather than words. The family members themselves often struggled to define what was normal, because for them it always had been. They could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on every choice, who to love, who to marry, even how to speak. Autonomy was a concept only whispered about, abstract and unattainable. This is the cruel paradox of inbreeding in isolation. It isn't always violent, it isn't always immediately catastrophic, but it is corrosive, wearing away at instinct, at choice, at the subtle architecture of human relationships. By the time the third generation appeared, the consequences were inescapable. Physical and psychological anomalies compounded with each birth. Siblings resembled one another in ways that were almost unnatural. Voices, gestures, even the cadence of speech reflected a past that should never have repeated itself. Despite this, the town maintained its silence. Outsiders occasionally caught glimpses of irregularity, but the family's careful maintenance of appearances kept them at bay. Neighbors who might have asked questions were quietly warned away. Teachers who noticed anomalies in behavior or appearance were placated with explanations that seemed plausible enough to avoid deeper inquiry. And so the cycle continued, decades of complicity creating a fortress around what should have been a scandal, an exposure, an awakening. The psychological toll was profound. Those born into this family struggled with a constant, unspoken tension. Relationships outside the family were fraught with confusion and guilt. Even love, when it arrived, was filtered through layers of inherited compulsion and fear. The outside world seemed incomprehensible, chaotic, threatening. Within the family, there was safety, but only because the safety itself was a cage. They were prisoners of blood, trapped in a narrative written long before they were born. At times, the eldest of the second generation would sense the enormity of what had been perpetuated. They might glimpse themselves in a mirror and notice features eerily familiar, a shadow of a parent repeated in unsettling ways. They might attempt to leave, to escape the weight of expectation. But the town, subtle in its enforcement, ensured most never truly succeeded. Jobs, relationships, reputations, every aspect of life could be subtly undermined by gossip, by misdirection, by the quiet consensus that the family must remain within the line. And then came the revelations, the ones that could no longer be contained. Old journals, long, buried letters and careful genealogical research revealed the patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. Cousins married cousins, siblings intertwined in ways meant to preserve blood and property, all while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. These documents, discovered decades later, painted a picture of deliberate, persistent inbreeding. It wasn't reckless. It was methodical. It was, in its own dark way, a family attempting to preserve its identity while the world around it moved forward, oblivious. By the end of this period, the consequences were impossible to ignore. The family tree had become a web, knots overlapping and twisting in ways no outsider could unravel. Genetic anomalies became commonplace. Emotional instability became a norm, and the town, while still silent in the face of direct acknowledgement, had learned to watch the family from a distance, to nod politely at their appearances, to avoid questions that could not be answered without confronting the unspeakable. The horror is not in shock or spectacle. It is in the quiet persistence, in the inexorable weight of history repeating itself. It is in the knowledge that choices, even subtle ones, made decades ago, can echo through generations, leaving a mark that cannot be erased. It is in the realization that what seems ordinary, church attendance, birthday celebrations, polite smiles, can conceal a reality so disturbing that most people would rather look away than face it. By the time the third generation came of age, the family had become a living archive of inherited secrets. Faces, bodies, and behaviors bore the unmistakable stamp of decades of repetition. What outsiders saw as coincidence or bad luck, insiders recognized as inevitability. Every birth, every relationship, every small decision seemed predetermined, a continuation of a legacy no one had chosen, but everyone was bound to follow. The psychological weight on these individuals was immense. They carried both the knowledge and the unspoken recognition of what had come before. Children who were only supposed to be cousins were instinctively drawn together in ways that society condemned but the family normalized. Affection, intimacy, love, They were all refracted through the prism of repetition, of a bloodline carefully, almost ritualistically preserved. No one outside the family could truly understand what it meant to live inside this inherited pattern, and even those within struggled to articulate it. Isolation became a protective shell. The family, aware of the judgment and horror the world would bring, retreated further into itself. Social invitations were declined, distant relatives kept at arm's length, and neighbors' curiosity deflected with practiced charm. And yet, for all their secrecy, there was a certain inevitability that could not be avoided. The family's history, like a shadow, stretched across generations, touching everything they did. It shaped marriages, friendships, and even the mundane act of conversation. Every choice was influenced by what had come before, whether consciously or unconsciously. By this point, some members began to recognize the consequences more clearly. Genetic disorders, emotional fragility, and social maladjustments were no longer anomalies, they were patterns. Siblings mirrored one another not just in appearance, but in temperament, in habits, even in minor physical quirks that should not have repeated so predictably. The family, once merely eccentric, now bore the mark of inbreeding with undeniable clarity. Yet even then, the unspoken rules held. Marriages within the line continued, justified by tradition, necessity, and the invisible coercion of legacy. Outside, observers occasionally stumbled upon fragments of the truth. A genealogist piecing together public records, a journalist examining old obituaries, or a relative tracing a family tree might sense something unusual, but most stopped short of full inquiry. The layers of secrecy were reinforced by decades of small-town complicity, by documents carefully altered, by memories blurred and reinterpreted. The story of the marriages, was buried beneath layers of denial and polite avoidance. It was a secret maintained not only by the family, but by the town itself. What makes this story unbearable is not simply that it happened, it's that it continued, almost meticulously, across decades. Each generation was shaped by choices made long before they were born. Each marriage was a repetition of the last, a shadow of previous unions. The family's identity became inseparable from the act of hiding itself. To leave the cycle was unthinkable, to question it, even in private, was almost impossible. And yet, the consequences of participation, emotional trauma, illness, a warped sense of normalcy, were unavoidable. The marriage and the family it produced existed in a world of its own creation. It was a microcosm governed by laws older than the individuals themselves, laws of blood, of secrecy, of repetition. Within this closed system, morality and instinct were warped, rewritten by necessity and survival. Love and affection became entangled with fear and compulsion. Normal childhoods were rare, replaced by a subtle, continuous negotiation between desire, obligation, and the invisible rules imposed by lineage. This is where the story turns from merely unsettling to psychologically devastating. The horror is not in violence or sudden catastrophe. It is in inevitability, the quiet, creeping realization that freedom, choice, and innocence were luxuries the family could never know. Every attempt to escape the pattern was met with subtle social reinforcement. A look from an elder, a whispered remark from a neighbor, a quiet insistence that tradition must be preserved. It was never shouted, never legislated. It was understood, absorbed, and enforced in the subtlest ways possible. And yet, there were moments of clarity, fleeting glimpses into what might have been if the cycle had been broken. Some tried to leave, moved to other towns, sought education, attempted normal relationships, but the pull of blood, of habit, of inherited expectation was strong. Letters returned unanswered, jobs faltered under strange misfortune, Romantic relationships faltered against unseen psychological barriers. It was as though the family's history exerted gravitational force, keeping every member tethered to the lineage, to the inescapable legacy of that original, secretive marriage. It is impossible to overstate the weight of such a burden. Imagine living knowing that every choice you make, every emotion you feel, every attraction and every aversion might be the echo of generations of secrets, repeating themselves silently, invisibly, inside your very cells. The family's story is a haunting illustration of what can happen when secrecy, isolation, and human compulsion intertwine, a living testament to the dark persistence of inherited patterns. Even now, the house where it began stands, silent and weathered. Neighbors pass by, children grow up, the town changes, but inside, the echoes of that original marriage linger. In the laughter, in the arguments, in the subtle mimicry of gestures passed down through decades, the story continues. History is not always written in textbooks or court records. Sometimes it is written in the blood of the living, in choices made in shadows, in the invisible inheritance of those who came before. To confront this story is to confront a quiet, relentless horror, the knowledge that human beings, when left to their own devices in isolation, can repeat patterns with shocking precision. That love, desire, and familial obligation can become entangled with compulsion and secrecy, producing outcomes that are both intimate and grotesque. That normalcy can exist alongside monstrosity, and the line between them can blur so completely that the world outside might never understand. And so the marriage, the lineage, the secrets all remain, buried yet persistent, quiet yet unrelenting, a warning that history, human nature, and hidden desires are forces far stronger than appearances suggest. They ripple through time, through generations, shaping lives in ways the world outside may never see. And for those who uncover the story, there is a lingering unease, the knowledge that even when hidden, the past is never truly gone, and some legacies cannot be escaped. The true horror, then, is not just what happened. It is that it could continue quietly, imperceptibly, beneath the surface of everyday life. A marriage that should never have existed, a bloodline that should have ended, a town that should have known better. And yet, here it is, a testament to secrecy, to silence, and to the inescapable weight of human repetition.